Hey everyone, after the tune, a special interview with renowned primatologist and ethologist, hugely popular author and scientist in the public eye, and all-around engaging person, distinguished Professor Emeritus Dr. Frans de Waal.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Well, hello again and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew MacIntosh from Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center. And in this episode, number 77, you'll hear an interview that's part of CICASP's International Primatology Lecture Series, Past, Present, and Future Perspectives of the Field, which we did this time with none other than Frans de Waal. Unlike our normal format for these lectures, in which our guests normally provide us with an origin story style lecture, we instead ran this event as an interview with Frans, led by Dr. Michael Huffman, as usual, and yours truly with a smattering of questions from participants, which include students and postdoctoral researchers affiliated with Kyoto University's program in primatology and wildlife science. As a result, I won't be giving the usual rundown of what the IPLS is, but you can find out more about these lectures and origin stories given by renowned primatologists and other scientists on the CICASP, that's CICASP YouTube channel, and right here in the PrimateCast Origins archives at theprimatecast.com. So, who's our guest, Frans de Waal? Well, having retired in 2019, Frans is now C.H. Candler Professor Emeritus at Emory University and Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Utrecht. He was named to Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People in 2007 and made a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1993, the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. in 2004, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, AAAS, in 2008. He was even made a Knight of the Order of the Netherlands Lion in 2010, which kind of makes this next accomplishment seem a little amusing. In 2012, he was awarded an Ig Nobel Prize, which recognizes science that makes you laugh, then makes you think, for finding with Jennifer Pokorny that chimpanzees can identify each other by observing their behinds. His TED Talk on the moral behavior of animals has been viewed over 5.5 million times, and the list goes on and on like this. Frans has also written numerous books stemming from his work in primatology, ethology, and evolution. Some of these include the iconic Chimpanzee Politics, Peacemaking Among Primates, The Ape and the Sushi Master, where he chronicles the history of primatology and the emergence of the idea that culture is not uniquely human, and The Bonobo and the Atheist, where he tackles challenging issues such as morality and religiosity in primates and in humans. One of my favorites, and one I often use as reference material in my undergrad comparative cognition class, is the book Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?, which really gets to the process of how we understand the intelligence and cognitive abilities of different species, including our own. More recently, Frans has written Mama's Last Hug, Animal Emotions and What They Teach Us About Ourselves, which presents an engaging look at animal emotions and their relation to our own, and his most recent book, Different, Gender Through the Eyes of a Primatologist, which is an ambitious and extremely topical look at sex and gender and their biological roots in the primate lineage. One of Frans's greatest contributions has been his ability to make complex scientific ideas and findings in animal behavior relatable to everyone, and to weave engaging stories with scientific results in a way that really makes us question what it is that both connects us and separates us from our primate cousins. While it was once dogmatic to avoid anthropomorphism in studying and understanding animal behavior at all costs, Frans has instead insisted that the opposite, anthropodenial, may be the greater sin, as it's couched in an inflated opinion of human cognition and behavior, so-called human exceptionalism, and has long prevented us from truly engaging with the idea that we're not so different from the many other minds that exist on this planet, many of which themselves are capable of exceptional feats of intelligence. So in this interview with Frans, we had a wide-ranging discussion about his books and his research, about his origins. And Frans is such a wonderful storyteller, and his engaging manner is sure to both inform and inspire the listener. As a fan myself, I thoroughly enjoyed this interview, and I think there's enough in here to satisfy anyone listening on the other end. One thing I wanted to get to in the interview, but didn't have time to, given the directions the conversation eventually went in, was the time I visited Dr. Hiroshi Ishiguro's robotics lab in Kyoto with Frans de Waal, and also with my friend and former PrimateCast host, Chris Martin, and a few others after attending a conference on cognition from both biological and machine perspectives, which was really interesting. But it was that event that led to our first interview with Frans back on the PrimateCast episode 9, which aired on December 13th, 2012, literally almost 10 years exactly to the month. We recorded a wonderful little video of Frans during that event, interacting with and even getting a hug from the Telenoid, a small humanoid robot, which was in Dr. Ishigo's lab and developed by his team. And I hope all of you listeners have a chance to check that out on the PrimateCast's YouTube channel. Just search for Frans de Waal Telenoid, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. But the reason I find it so relevant today is that the emergence of generative artificial intelligence, or GAI, that we see now in things like ChatGPT, which is really shaking things up. And then in the Telenoid's case, 10 years ago, there was a real human actually voicing the robot that you can see in the video. And now that's pretty much become probably irrelevant, or at least will be in the near future. Frans de Waal has for decades searched for morality in the behavior and thought processes of animals other than ourselves, and has provided compelling evidence that we are not alone in our ability to empathize with others. So perhaps the next great challenge for humanity will be the search for empathy and morality, or the design of those, in these new digital minds. And perhaps that will be a future interview that we can do with Frans in a part 3 on the PrimateCast. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoy our interview with distinguished Professor Frans de Waal, which begins here with Dr. Michael Huffman's warm introduction.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome, Frans. It's really a great pleasure to have Frans on this series. I've known him for a number of years now. I was trying to think when the first time we physically met, but something that's deep in my memories is the first access I had to some of Frans's works, and that's the now iconic book Chimpanzee Politics. I often try to introduce some of the books of the speakers. When I was reading through Frans's book, I was just diving into Japanese macaque politics in Kyoto when I was studying the Arashiyama group, and it really opened my eyes to the world of primate cognition and some of the day-to-day interactions that animals have with each other and what that can tell us about ourselves. So I was really impressed with the work of Frans in his earliest book. And another book on myself is The Ape and the Sushi Master. That was when Frans actually came to Japan and really lent a great service to introducing Japanese primatology and the early history of Imanishi and some of the contemporary primatologists at the time that Frans was visiting us here in Japan. I had the pleasure of taking him over to my mentor's house, Professor Itani, and we did some touring around Kyoto and up to Arashiyama, of course. But the one that I've really, really fallen in love with lately, it's got a really catchy title, is Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And I read through this in a couple sittings. I just couldn't put it down. It really reads like some of the old classical European ethnological popularized science stories like those of Conrad Lorenz. It's really, really a nice book. And if you have a chance, please get a copy. I think it's really a wonderful window into the world of all animals. Jumping back to Chimpanzee Politics and a way of starting off this conversation, I noticed that you dedicate this book to Jan van Hoof, your graduate advisor. I've known Jan for many years as well. He's a wonderful man, very, very knowledgeable in all aspects. I kind of think of him as the Itani of the Netherlands, his personality and his breadth and everything. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you got started in your field and what your experiences were as a graduate student under Jan's guidance?
Yeah. It was great. Well, thanks for the introduction and all the compliments and everything. And I'm glad to be here. And Chimpanzee Politics that was my first book. I had written some articles before it, and of course written many articles since it. But it was the first popular book that I wrote. And Jan van Hoof, my professor, he was a bit nervous about that. I was talking about primate strategies and social behavior, and I was calling it politics. And he felt I was not very careful. But, I was a student at the time, and in the beginning of my career, I had nothing to lose, basically. I felt it's not like an established scientist who takes an enormous risk. I felt very strongly that primates have strategies and that they have cognition and that politics is the right word to use. But let me tell you a funny story. There were some political scientists who objected to the term politics. And not the primatologists. There was not a single primatologist who objected to the term. It must be because we all think that they have politics, But there were some political scientists who invited me to a political science conference, and they had a whole panel discussion. What is politics, and can the primates have it? That was the question. And I was there, it was like an inquisition for me, because I showed them pictures of politicians, how the politicians always posture and look big and strong. And I felt it was very chimpanzee-like, and I had comparisons like that, body language, basically. But that's not what they wanted to talk about. They had definitions like politics is the system of rules for society or something like that. They had complex definitions. And they felt that chimpanzees didn't have those rules. And then there was an older gentleman in the audience, an older political scientist, who said, why don't we go with the most popular definition of politics? And I thought, well, which one is that? And the most popular one that has a book title like that, politics is who gets what, when, and how. I said, well, if that's the definition of politics, we can talk, And so we decided that actually that definition might be applicable to the primates. And so we ended up being on good terms on this. But Jan was nervous about me being so popular in my writing. But Jan was a great mentor, because for me it's very important. He studied facial expressions. And he worked with a psychologist, Nico Freida, who studied emotions in humans. Mm-hmm. And, facial expressions and emotions is almost the same topic. And Jan was not nervous about the term emotions. He did not use it much in his writings. He had been asked by Tinbergen to stay away from the term, but he was not nervous about it. He felt animals probably had emotions. And so I grew up in an environment as a young scientist where that was not a taboo topic, which I think is very important, because many of us of my generation, they grew up, the word emotion could not be used, feeling could not be used, consciousness, intention, understanding, intelligence. Intelligence could not be used, because people would say, what is intelligence? Isn't it just a learning ability? And then they had reduced it to learning, which was the only thing they cared about. And so I was happy to have a professor who was a bit more open-minded than that.
And that's kind of like the debate that went on a little bit later with the word culture in primates, and how difficult that is for some places. And you get cultural anthropologists facing primatologists, and the hair starts flying. And that's settled down.
Because they had definitions of culture. There was a definition, I don't know who made that. The definition is, culture is what makes us human. Well, if that's a definition, then, we cannot talk about primate culture. And I think Imanishi, the refreshing thing of the Japanese primatology was that they didn't have these sort of prejudices in that regard. Right. They wondered what culture was, and he wondered if a wasp could have it. And now we have actually insect studies that seem to indicate social learning.
Yeah.
So we're getting to that point, you know?
Yeah. Emotion and play in bumblebees even, which is exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Frans, I think in a previous interview we did for the PrimateCast, you were talking about how you felt some kinship with some of the Japanese primatologists as well. In the context of language, you were talking about how as a non-native English speaker, there's challenges to be able to get heard and the world can be a bit dominated. But I think what you just mentioned also, how maybe there was less taboo in Japan about thinking about some of the ideas of culture and sociality in primates and relating that to human behavior as well. I mean, that was the whole raison d'etre for why Imanishi was starting to study primates, was to understand human society. And I just wonder if you also felt some kinship in that in your earlier days and with what was being done in Japan.
Yeah, I've always felt close to Japanese primatology, partly because as a student, I was warned away from Japanese papers. So as a student, and I was not the only one, I've heard the same story from students of Robert Hind and other people in the West, is we were told Japanese primatology is not to be taken seriously because they use names for their monkeys, which is already wrong. And they talk about culture and they follow them over time. And they don't talk much about species-specific behavior, which was the big thing for the ethologists. They talk more about individual relationships. And so I always felt that was unfair to Japanese primatology to be like that. And now, of course, we all have adopted the methodology that came out of that. Is if you talk to a researcher on hyenas or elephants, they name their animals and they follow them over time, which is exactly the same methodology. So I felt Japanese primatology has won in that regard, but they were not recognized. And I remember that when I came to Japan to talk about all these issues in 20 years ago or so, that I heard that, for example, Itani, I think Itani told us that story, that he toured the US with Ray Carpenter. Ray Carpenter was a friend of his, was an American who really appreciated Japanese primatology. And he toured the US and people didn't want to believe that he could recognize 100 monkeys. They saw there was an impossibility. And so they laughed at him. It's not possible. And of course, now many people do that and are capable of doing that. But that was the thinking at the time. People didn't take it seriously. Yeah, and the other issue with Japanese primatology is that I feel that in scientific conferences, the native English speakers, they have an easy life and they don't realize it. They can make jokes. How will you ever, if you talk in another language, going to make a joke that falls well? That's very difficult. So they always win all the debates. They have most to say. They have the best expressions for what they want to say. And all the people who speak a different language, they're sort of struggling to keep up with them. And the native speakers don't realize that. They don't realize the tremendous advantage that they have. And as a result, if someone comes with new ideas, like Imanishi did, he came with new ideas about the family, about culture, about individual relationships and so on. They're going to be translated by the native speakers in other language. And so I remember, for example, Toshisada Nishida, who I was friends with, and I visited his field site and so on in the Mahala Mountains. Nishida had discovered that chimpanzees have a unit group, as he called it, in the meaning that you see them traveling alone or in small parties, but they're all glued together in one bigger group. They don't always travel together, but they're all together. That's the group. And later, of course, we learned, he didn't know that at the time, I believe, but then we learned that they are territorial and highly aggressive to each other also. But he called it a unit group. But we never talk about unit groups anymore. We talk about communities. Chimpanzees have communities. So the English speakers repackaged the idea of Nishida in another term that was better. And as a result, we forget where it came from, but the concept came actually from him. And so I sympathize with that because I'm not a native English speaker, even though I think my language, Dutch, is as close as you can get to English. I mean, it's extremely close. But even for me to write an English article or book, I have to have a big dictionary next to me and leaf through it. And it takes an enormous amount of time to write in English. And I don't have that anymore, but it used to be like that. And so I sympathize with people who struggle with the language. And I feel the native English speakers need to be taken that into account a bit more than they do normally.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you about that. You've written so many things, and you write so eloquently. Was it always easy for you or difficult? And you kind of answered that. But how did you become as proficient as you are? Just in a few words, I think there's a lot of students listening in who have the same situation. They're coming from another language. I did the same thing living here in Japan, and greatly appreciate that struggle and the difficulties. If you could just relate a little bit more about that process and how you became.
So my writing, if I compare my writing with, let's say, other primatologists who write popular books, like, let's say, Robert Sapolsky, who I admire greatly, or Sarah Hardy, then I think, my English is so primitive. It's so, I'm sort of embarrassed by it. On the other hand, since I write in another language, I'm simple. So I write simple sentences, and I look for the best adjective that I can use for something. Instead of some authors, they have 10 adjectives with commas between them because they have so much choice in their vocabulary, and I don't. I try to pick the best one. And so as a result, my writing is simpler. And of course, for popular writing, that's not a bad thing necessarily to have simple writing. And I remember when Kummer wrote a book, Hans Kummer, he wrote a book which was semi-popular about the ecology of the Hamadryas baboons. And I remember him telling me, he said, my writing is very simple, but it's understandable. And I think that's at least what you can say. But when I read someone like Sapolsky, I think, well, my English is primitive. But I cannot change that. It's not my language, and so I cannot change that. And I like writing in popular books. Compared to writing scientific articles, I've written, I don't know, maybe 200-300 scientific articles. And that's a very different kind of writing because that's very regimented. The introduction, and you need to cite the right sources, and then the methodology, and then the results, and you need to have the right statistics, and then the discussion. And it's extremely constrained what you do, and it's very technical. And you're not supposed to show that you have fun in your research, and you're not supposed to tell funny anecdotes about things, and certainly not mention the exceptions because you're trying to convince them that your data is very convincing. So you're not going to talk about exceptional behaviors. So the scientific articles is a bit of a boring business, I think, writing those. And so then when you write a popular book, all of a sudden you can say, well, I'm going to talk about this, and you can mention an anecdote, and I like to tell anecdotes, even though you also need to make clear to the readers that behind the anecdote sometimes there's more evidence than just the anecdote. So you can describe, let's say, a power struggle between two males, but you always need to make clear that that's not the only one you have seen, and that it's maybe a pattern, because otherwise people get confused about that. So I enjoy that very much, writing popular books, but it's a very different business it's like a separate career almost from your scientific papers. Yeah.
And I think you use a separate part of your brain. I feel that as well, just sitting down and writing, trying to describe something that I've seen in the field to other people or to colleagues or friends. And it just feels like a different part of the brain is heating up than when you're sitting down and writing a scientific paper, like you said.
Yeah. And Frans, maybe that's a good way to transition into thinking about some of these books you've written. So you've tackled, I'll just list a few of things. Politics and Chimpanzee Politics, morality and religion, empathy, now sex and gender in your most recent book, Different. And you mentioned you enjoy reading it, and you can tell stories in a way that you don't. But what is your process for deciding what to write about?
Yeah. The book on gender is a bit unusual because I decided to do that because it's such a hot topic in society, and because I noticed that people are fascinated by the biology of it. They hear, of course, very often in the news and on the media that gender is purely cultural and that we can change it any way we want, and it's a flexible and then they talk to me as a primatologist and they want to hear what I think, because I think they're skeptical about the idea that it's so cultural and so flexible. Because anyone who has raised a boy and a girl knows that they don't behave the same way. And so they want to hear from a primatologist, what do you think about the biology of gender? And for me, it's a less loaded topic. So if I were to talk about humans, people might get very upset if I say men and women are different. But if I talk about chimpanzees, they accept it because this is based on observation and measurement and stuff like that. And so the acceptance rate is higher. And that's how I ended up on that particular topic. But most of my topics have to do with cognition and emotions in animals. And my writing about the evolution of morality in some, like in Good Natured and some of the other books, is an extension of that, because I feel morality has a lot to do with empathy. And that's a topic that I'm very interested in. And when I first started to write about empathy, which is like in the 1990s, first of all, people didn't believe animals could have that. That's one thing. But the other one was also that they said it relates to morality. That would make animals moral beings, which I'm not sure I would agree with. I think morality is probably bigger than empathy. But anyway, that's how they looked at it. And that's how I got interested in that topic and the evolution of morality.
So I think when you started, well, before Chimpanzee Politics, I think if I remember correctly, you started your primatological career thinking about studying aggression in the chimpanzees at Arnhem Zoo in the Netherlands. And I think I've read or heard you say that there just wasn't as much as maybe you expected, or you started thinking a bit differently about what society, the parts that made up society, and you fell onto conflict resolution. So yeah, can you maybe talk about the process there and what kind of you discovered in those earlier kind of studies of the chimpanzees at the zoo?
Well, that's interesting. When I was a student, Conrad Lawrence had written his book on aggression, which was the big book at the time. And no one could talk about anything else than aggression and violence. All the books about human evolution were about how we are an aggressive species. Now, maybe after World War II, there was a logical thing to say and a logical obsession. And all the studies that I saw on animals had to relate to aggression somehow. And so I was asked by Jan van Hoof and others to work on aggressive behavior in the chimpanzee. And so I went to the Arnhem Zoo, which was the big colony I worked on, which was the biggest colony and still is probably in the world, 25 chimps on a very big island. And I didn't see much aggression. These chimps were laying around the whole day and then grooming and then playing. And sometimes there was a fight, but you had to wait really long to see a fight between them. And so for me, that first year with the chimps was a time that I got to know their personalities, I got to know their facial expressions and all sorts of things about them. But aggression was not the big topic. And then about a year into it, the males started to shuffle their dominance relationships. And there were challenges by one male to another and so on. And that's when I started to see conflicts. And that's also when I started to see reconciliations after conflicts. And so individuals who had a fight and then would embrace and kiss 10 minutes later. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And so I actually got much more interested in the reconciliation part than the aggression part. And I still remember going to conferences where everyone was talking about competition and aggression and violence, and in all sorts of animals, in rats and sticklebacks and all sorts of animals, aggressive behavior, threat behavior. What does it mean? What is the motivational system? That was sort of the terminology that they used at the time. And I would come and I say, well, the chimpanzees reconcile after fights. They kiss and embrace. Isn't that interesting? And they were all sort of like, wow, what is this? They had never thought about that there was a possibility to do that. And what does it mean? And I remember people dismissing it. People saying, well, maybe chimpanzees do that because they do a lot of stuff that we humans do, but my animals would never do that. My animals would never reconcile after a fight. But now we know that almost all social animals, dolphins, whales, elephants, wolves, you name it, they have reconciliations after fights. But it didn't fit with their thinking, because their thinking was who wins, who loses, who gets the resources. The competition needs to be functional, of course. And so they had no room for reconciliation. Let me tell you a funny story about that. I went with Jan van Hoof to a group of psychologists in Amsterdam. We were in Utrecht, a different city. And so we went to Amsterdam because we were proposing for a student of them a study on reconciliation behavior in the chimpanzee. And these were all rat psychologists. So they worked on rats, mostly Skinnerian. A rat in a box needs to press a lever to get food and stuff like that, And so Jan and I were sitting at the table with all these psychologists. And we said, we want to do this study on reconciliation behavior in the chimpanzees. And the people laughed at us. And they said, it's not possible. It's just not possible that they have reconciliation. And so we kept going back and forth. And I showed some data and some slides. But, there's only so much you can do to convince people. And then Jan at some point proposed, he said, you know what we do? You come to Arnhem Zoo, which is, again, a different city, but Holland is very small, so it was like an hour by train. You come to the Arnhem Zoo, and you watch the chimpanzees with us, and I'm sure something will happen. You will find it interesting. And they refused. They said, no, we don't need to come. We don't need to come to see it because we know it cannot exist. And Jan said, well, if you come, maybe you can see something that's interesting. Now, they were convinced it was not a possibility. And so there was really no reason. So we did the project anyway with that student. And we avoided the word reconciliation because, so we called it post-conflict contact. Because they found that more acceptable. So there was a lot of resistance to that kind of thinking at the time.
Mm-hmm. All great ideas seem to face a lot of tough resistance in the beginning. And it's a shame that it takes so long sometimes for these paradigm changes to happen. Science.
Yeah, so how was that with self-medication? I suppose self-medication was also a ridiculous idea at the time.
Yeah, it was very hard to convince people. It got a bad start because of the overuse of mass media to describe what was going on, and then scientists couldn't buy how it was being described. And there wasn't a lot of data in the beginning as well. So it sounds like the media sometimes they mess things up also. Yeah, and leading scientists of the day, what they say, everyone follows for a long time, and it seems to be kind of a not so healthy environment sometimes. But yeah. But popular science changes people's ideas, like you've done. I think you've gotten a lot of people interested in the topics that you're interested in, and the fields have really fertilized and become common to most people. Popular science is actually very important to draw people into a field. I think the scientists don't always realize that, but if you want to attract young people into a field, they're not going to start with the scientific articles. It has to come from elsewhere. It has to come from either documentaries on TV or popular books. Yeah. Right. I was going to ask you that question. I'm glad you brought that up. I guess you've answered it. The role of popular science in moving science forward. You think that it's a very important process. Do you think that all young scientists should try like what you did with the Chimpanzee Politics in some level and try and push an idea out there? Is that a good idea? Or
I think popularization is an important skill and that young scientists should learn. I always recommend them not to start with a book, to start with some articles in some magazines, or we used to have things like Natural History or National Geographic, and there are fewer now, but there are many blogs and there are many places where I think outlets where you can try your hand at this kind of stuff. So don't start with a big book. That's going to be a disaster because it takes a lot of concentration and work to do that right,
and a lot of time.
Yeah, start with some shorter articles and see how that goes. Yeah, and then hopefully you have some good editors who also work on your text.
In relation to that, Frans, I know that when this was, I think, big news, but after Chimpanzee Politics, there were some American politicians who also wanted to use the concepts that you were writing about and wonder if there's actually some value to them. And this, I think, relates to how you've always tried to weave the stories that you're telling about primates into some way to help us understand ourselves and how we might kind of organize or behave, or maybe to understand the origins of the behaviors we perform. Mm-hmm. But maybe you can talk about that later. But a simpler question is, in addition to, I think it was Newt Gingrich maybe was talking about your Chimpanzee Politics, but do you have any other kind of anecdotes about how, maybe for any of your books, how kind of people in certain positions have taken the information and tried to kind of fit it into their agenda, or and maybe with your recent Sex and Gender book, that might also be something to talk about.
So there was a project in the US on forgiveness, which took my reconciliation approaches. I've always been a bit uncomfortable with that because I'm happy to talk about reconciliation as a process where two individuals embrace and kiss after a fight and repair their relationship. Whether they forgive each other is, that's an internal process. Even in humans, I often doubt that people forgive. They may reconcile. That doesn't necessarily mean that they really forgive and forget. So I found that connection. I found it a bit difficult. But many people have used my material. I'm often invited, for example, to speak to family therapists or for business people who want to talk about the business side and reciprocity. I did these experiments on fairness, for example. They're interested in that kind of issues, which is more like an economics issue. There are many sort of vague applications of what I do in the real world, even though in the end, people always want to know what humans do more than what the primates do, I think.
Right. So maybe that's related to the forgiveness issue. I think you have also made the important point. So empathy is something that pro-social behavior and empathy is something you've studied for quite some time. And I believe it has now become pretty widely accepted that there are at least some elements of empathy in non-humans. And I remember 10 years ago, when we did this interview for the PrimateCast, actually, you were talking about theory of mind and empathy and how there are different components maybe, or different elements that species, even humans, we might have, a subset of the components, but maybe not all of them. And you mentioned that maybe in 10 years from now, this was back in 2012, in 10 years from now, empathy might be looked at in the same way, that there will be all of these different subcomponents of empathy. And you've also mentioned that the expression of emotion and the subjective sensation of feelings are to be viewed as two very different things. And maybe that's related to this forgiveness idea versus reconciliation. So can you maybe talk about that, the nuances of those?
Yeah, in the emotion research, that's very difficult, just to talk about the feelings of animals. So I can measure emotions. Whether it's in a rat or in a chimp or in a human, I can measure blood pressure, facial expressions, sounds that they make. Emotions are easily measurable. And emotions are sometimes very similar, especially between other primates and ourselves, the way they express it, and the way it affects the heart rate and the blood pressure and all sorts of physiological measures. So emotions is I think, a completely acceptable and easy topic to address. Feelings, the feelings of a chimpanzee, which I think is an internal state, a subjective state, is not accessible to me. And I must say the same is true for humans. So you may describe your feelings to me. You may say, I was sad at the funeral of X, but I don't know if your sadness is the same as my sadness. And I don't know exactly what went on inside of you. And so even for human feelings, I would be a bit skeptical. And a lot of the research on emotions in psychology at the moment with humans is actually what I would call feelings. Is they show people certain images and they have them click on certain, like angry, sad, happy. They have them click on these feeling terminologies. It's not research on emotions. That's research on feelings, and that's also why we have this big debate. I don't know if you're following this Louise Feldman Barrett, who claims for the emotions that they are constructs. Emotions are constructed culturally and with language. That is true for feelings. I'm not sure that is true for emotions. If I bring a big tiger into the room and you're sitting there on a chair and you didn't expect a tiger, I think there's going to be physiological changes in you that you have absolutely no control over and that have nothing to do with cultural constructs. Your heart rate will go up. You will get cold feet. You may defecate even. I mean, all sorts of things can happen physiologically that you have no control over. And so the psychologists, when they talk about emotions, they actually very often mean feelings. And when I talk about emotions in my chimps, most of the time, I mean bodily changes and facial expressions and sounds that they produce and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think that distinction is extremely important to make. And I've been in debates about people because there's, in addition, in the psychology literature, there's certain emotions that they call basic. I don't know if you know the 6 basic emotions. And they say the 6 basic emotions are the ones that we humans have all over the world. They're universal. And we share them with other species, like, let's say, fear and anger and stuff like that. And then all the rest of the emotions, and there's many, many more, they are secondary and they are us. They're ours. They don't exist in other species. Mm-hmm. And I don't agree with that at all. I think all of the human emotions, one way or another, can be found in other species. They may be more elaborate in us. They may be more developed sometimes in us, like shame and guilt may be more developed in our species, but that doesn't mean that they're totally absent in other species. But the psychologists, they like to cling to this idea that there are 6 basic emotions that we humans share with animals and all the rest is our emotional life. And I have trouble with that idea. And it may be true for some species. I don't know non-primates very well, but I doubt that it is true for the primates, for sure. Yeah.
I'd like to bring in an audience question. Sanjana has a very relevant question to this discussion. So maybe, Sanjana, do you want to take the mic and fire away? Oh, wrong person. I'm sorry.
Sanjita. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Sanjita. My mistake. Sanjita, please.
It's okay. Yeah. So it's really glad to talk to Professor, and I'm always inspired by his work. I have a question about animal grief. And I just wanted to know what stage we are in understanding grief in animal. And if we think that, the state of grief exists in animals, sometimes we also see killings and infanticides and cannibalism within species. So that gives us a doubt whether the emotion like grief actually exists in animal or not. So that's what I want to understand from Professor. What is his viewpoint or perspective about it? Yeah,
I think grief probably exists because we do see depressed reactions and in animals who lose, for example, someone. So it's of course grief is always related to attachment. I don't think you would grieve for anyone who you're not attached to. And so a mother who loses her offspring, or an adult who loses his or her best friend, that's where you're going to see grief. You're not going to see grief. And people sometimes talk with me like they have a dog and the dog did not grieve over the cat who died. Well, then I always ask, was the dog attached to the cat? That's a logical question. And if because I do know animals who are very attached even to other species in the home, and I think then there's a strong reaction. And I think these reactions in chimpanzees, for example, I've seen cases where a female chimpanzee has lost her offspring and screams for 3 days. She sits in the corner. She doesn't want to participate with anybody. And she occasionally screams and is very depressed, doesn't eat. So yeah, I think that's a very depressed state, and I wouldn't mind calling it grief. So I do think these feelings may exist sometimes. And in the wild, it's of course a bit harder to observe than in captivity. But for example, we recently had a very interesting episode in the Arnhem Zoo where a female chimp had a stillbirth. So she was expecting. All of a sudden, the baby is she has a stillbirth. The baby is dead and taken away, and there was a very strong reaction of the rest of the group to her. So not only was she depressed, clearly, but the whole group responded with a lot of affiliative gestures to her. And not only on the first day, they did that on the first day, but they did it for a month or so. Mm. So I believe that paper was published in Primates, maybe. But anyway, there was a very strong reaction. And so I think the other chimps recognize the grief also of an individual. So yeah, I'm a believer that it exists, certainly in some species that have strong attachments.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. So the follow-up question is that so we do know that there are some evidence of grief in primates and non-human primates, but like sometime when I'm reading, I see that there are many hypotheses related to it, but something related to cannibalism, infanticides, and killings, that how we can justify it, like the same animal which was emotional or having grief now is now eating its own infant. So how it's really contradicting. So sometimes it gives a big question mark of whether grief exists, whether it's only for an individual or for the entire group.
Yeah, I know that the primates, they can be very, very mean to each other and kill each other. I never think that that's an argument against, let's say, grief or empathy or whatever. People say that sometimes. If I talk about, let's say, empathy in chimpanzees, you say, do you know that these guys, they kill each other? And of course I know that. But we can say the same thing about humans. Humans kill each other on a massive scale, actually a much bigger scale, I would say, than chimpanzees ever do. Genocide is not something that is typical in the primates, but in humans it happens quite a bit. And so that's not an argument against saying that humans have grief or empathy or tender emotions. So we recognize that humans can have both. They can both be extremely nasty and be extremely altruistic and empathic. And the same is true. Chimpanzees are complex beings too. And so the same is true for other species. These things can coexist within the individual. But people sometimes use that as argument because they do want to maintain the view of nature as nasty and a struggle for life. Nature is presented still by most people as the place where extreme competition happens. And you see that also in the anthropology literature, where they constantly emphasize how cooperative the human species is, so extremely cooperative characters, and these animals, they're all competing with each other and they don't even know what cooperation is. They're very poor at it. And I think that's the strangest argument. Nature is full of cooperation among all sorts of animals. And I'm not even thinking about the social insects. And I'm thinking of all sorts of species cooperate. And to emphasize now all of a sudden, because that's a sort of fashionable at the moment, cooperation in humans and then contrast it with the other species, I think is hopeless. It goes back to, because I mentioned that in the old days, we only looked at aggressive behavior and violence. It goes back to that time, because when it comes to violence and aggression, we always favor the connection with animals. If people kill each other, we say they're acting like animals. So the violent behavior is always connected with nature. As soon as we humans do wonderful things, which we always do, we can also be very altruistic and nice to each other, then we claim it for ourselves and we say that's us. We call it humane behavior. It's us. We are the ones who are nice, and animals cannot be that way. And I think it's a simplification of nature, a simplification of us, and of the connection between the two. But yeah, that happens quite a bit.
Yeah, and for context there, Sanjit also has recently worked on some, expression of grief in elephant societies. So
elephants. I've worked with elephants actually, and I think the elephant is another underestimated creature. And certainly in terms of emotions, I think the elephant has an enormous range of emotions to offer.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah.
So I want to get in this next audience question from Kenneth, but before I do, I'll preface it a little bit. So Frans, you were just explaining or talking about the parallels and continuities between potentially these experiences or behaviors in other species and ourselves. And primatologists have long been in the business of trying to understand, where we come from. And there's a lot of kind of fraught rhetoric around biological, for example, determinism, that has expressed itself in various ways. Even Konrad Lorenz has an unfortunate kind of run-in with the eugenicists. And of course, there's still debates about the biology of IQ, whether it's even something scientists should consider or study. But Kenneth has a question here about kind of responsibility of scientists. And I think you're a good person to answer it, having written many popular books about it. So Kenneth, do you want to come and throw this one at Frans?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, especially when you were mentioning the context of overemphasizing on aggression and in non-human primates, whereas reconciliation also happens a lot. I was wondering if you think that primatologists have some form of indirect responsibility to be aware of in how we see ourselves when we potentially overemphasize on some topics.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that in relation to my gender book, because some people, some feminists, they look at biology as the enemy because they feel biology is deterministic, reductionistic, and biology tells humans how to behave. And they don't want to hear that. And so they look at biology as something to be avoided and something problematic. And I think I agree with them to some degree, in the sense that the way we biologists have handled the topics is not appropriate. So remember, for example, how Dawkins would talk about biology. Richard Dawkins would say, we are the slaves of our genes. We are here to carry out the programs of our genes. Ed Wilson had the same sort of talk in social biology. Like, social biology will take over the world and we barely need the social sciences. And they would give lip service to culture. They would say, culture is sort of important. And maybe we primatologists, since we understand the interaction between cultural learning and biology, we are studying this. And since we sometimes work with species like chimpanzees and bonobos, who we consider adults when they're 14, 15, 16. I mean, they have a very long development. Elephants is another good example. Whales are another good example. There are animals who are very slow. And why are they slow in their development? Is because they need to learn an enormous amount of things before they are competent adults. And so we primatologists maybe have a responsibility to wean people off this idea that biology is deterministic, that biology is sort of the dictator who tells us how to behave. And in biology of the 1970s and 80s has, and if you go back to Lawrence with his instincts, that's even more primitive in a way. We have been giving this message that biology is in charge. And I think we should be much more careful and much more modest in how we promote the idea of biology, because biology always interacts with the environment. There is no pure biology in the world. There is no pure culture in the world. And I think we primatologists, we are in an excellent position to bring that message.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So I think in your career, if I read you well, Frans, one of the things you've often noted was that we also have a very high opinion of what it is that we do and how it is that we think. And I wonder if maybe you can comment on human exceptionalism and maybe some of the problems with that, and also maybe you can eventually get into the idea of anthropodenial as well.
Yeah. Humans, I don't know why we have that. We want to be unique and different, and we are, of course, in a way, unique and different. But we want to emphasize that, and there are entire fields, like especially anthropology, where that's almost like the topic. It's like they say that the topic of anthropology is to find out what is special about humans. And I don't know why we have gotten into that position where we need to find out what's special about humans, because I think humans are primates, and 95% of what we do is primate-like. And yeah, there's a few things that are human-like, but why focus on that small tip of the iceberg? But they want to do that. And I invented the word anthropodenial because I got sick and tired of the word anthropomorphism being thrown at everything you propose. As soon as you say animals have empathy, or they cooperate, or they have politics, or whatever you say that is new to people, especially, because once they accept it. But when you throw a new thing at them, they say that's anthropomorphic, and that's an immediate rejection because we cannot be anthropomorphic. That's just not acceptable. And so I invented the word anthropodenial for people who deny the connection with other species. And unfortunately, that is still a very substantial group in academia. So I sometimes find the general public more open-minded than the academics. So when you talk, for example, about emotions in animals, there's always people who come up to you and say, my dog or my cat. They always talk about their pets, of course. They don't necessarily talk about the farm animals as if these are a different category who don't have emotions, but they have emotions too. But at least the general public has no trouble with you saying that animals can have emotions. But academics, there's still quite a few who will say, what do you mean? What do you mean by emotions? And how do you define them? And then before you know it, you're in a sort of semantic debate, and you're not going to go anywhere with that. But there is a strong tendency in humans to want to be exceptional. I think humans are much less special than they think. Even for language, language is the one trait that I think is really specifically human. But if you were to measure human sound production, like my voice here and my sounds, if you were to analyze them the way we analyze primate vocalizations, you would not find out that it's very special. It's a sort of gibberish that's coming out. You would probably see the spectrograms, and you would have no clue that this was a symbolized kind of language. And that means automatically also that we may be underestimating the sounds of other species. If you measure the sounds of, let's say, a dolphin with a hydrophone, who knows what these dolphins are communicating with each other? We have no clue, probably. It may not be symbolized, that's possible, but it may still be very special. So I think people emphasize these things, and they always have differences that they propose. And if you have a long life, like Mike and I, we have been around a long time. We have seen many, you can probably make a list of 20 claims that have been around about how special humans are that have fallen apart somehow. So, but that's sort of the pattern, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
In addition to the claims, you've also seen the methodologies change a lot from when you started to what you're doing now and how we kind of test for these things. It could be theory of mind, it could be empathy, it could be any other sort of behavior. And now I am going to call on Sanjana, actually, because she had a question very relevant to this now.
Can you put on your camera, Sanjana, or your mic?
I've put on my mic. Can you hear me?
Please. Yes.
Yeah. Following up on both the progress for how research is being done and for feeling and emotion based, the idea of how you can test feelings or emotions or these debates. Nowadays, we're moving more towards eye tracking, and we're trying to use technology for a lot of different ways to record data and to capture data. So what are your thoughts on these kind of approaches? Like, would it be a good explanation? Are they good uses for justifying like emotions or feelings?
I love the eye tracking study that was done on theory of mind, for example. So eye tracking is really a very good new technique. Of course, the field workers are also using increasingly molecular techniques of getting at oxytocin and DNA, and that's enormously increasing. I think also we're going to get non-invasive neuroscience. I don't like invasive neuroscience on the primates. I'm not a big fan of that. And I think, but non-invasive neuroscience is, of course, done on humans all the time. We put them in scanners and we give them a potential problem and we see what their brain is doing. And we are not at the point yet that that's easy with the primates. And I know that some people are training monkeys to be in the scanner or training dogs to be in the scanner. But when the technology advances, maybe we can get non-invasive neuroscience going on them. And that will also help tremendously getting at these questions of consciousness and feelings versus emotions and what's going on inside. We basically would be opening the black box, I think. So I think that's going to come. It's not entirely there yet, but I would recommend everyone who is a primatologist, and especially those who are interested in cognition and emotions, to get some degree in neuroscience as well. I think that's going to be the future. And again, I'm not for the invasive type. That used to be common, lesions in the brain or electrodes in the brain. But I think non-invasive neuroscience has a future in primatology too.
Yeah. Maybe this is a funny one to follow that up with, but novel technologies. There's also one classic technology, which is the mirror self-recognition test, which I know you've been involved with for various studies. But so do cleaner wrasse have theory of mind?
Theory of mind, I don't know, but I'm very impressed by Koda's studies on these fish. It's just amazing, and I've developed this idea. Well, I'm not the only one, I'm sure, that you need to look at it as a gradualist perspective. So instead of saying there's some animals who have self-awareness and other animals who don't, which is what the mirror test used to say, like the great apes have it and all other species don't have it. I think there are gradual differences. For example, monkeys. I worked with capuchin monkeys. They don't mistake the mirror image for a stranger. They don't react to the mirror image as if it's a stranger. It's not themselves. They don't make that connection, but it's also not a stranger. So what is it? It's in between. And the child developmental people, they say that children reach a stage also like that. They recognize themselves at the age of 18 months to 24 months. But before that time, the half year before that time, they're also in between. They don't see it as themselves, but they also don't see it as a stranger. So I think we need to have a more subtle vocabulary about the whole thing rather than saying that some animals are self-aware and others are not, because I bet every animal needs some level of self-awareness,
Yeah, I think that go back to the title of one of your books. I don't think we're smart enough yet to know how smart animals are.
Yeah. We're constantly struggling with this issue, but it's so interesting that we live in a time that we are allowed to do that, because there was a time when I was young if you would say this chimp understands that A leads to B, you would be criticized, because the word understanding you were not allowed to use that for animals. Animals don't understand. Animals learn in contingencies, but that's all they do.
Yeah.
Well, Frans, our hour is pretty much up here, and we would like to let you go. But maybe you just recommended one piece of advice for all the young primatologists and students that maybe neuroscience, non-invasive neuroscience, could be one important avenue to look into. Do you have any other kind of parting words for the young scholars here, and maybe how to go forward and forge their special careers as you've done?
Yeah, I don't know what to say, but I think the field work needs to continue, and I hope it can continue for a long time. We all know that the primates are in trouble, and I think that's certainly an important avenue. And I think the people who work on cognition and emotions, they have an enormous field in front of them, because I really think we only have scratched the surface at this point, especially because we were held back for so long to look into this. And so I think for the younger generation, there's an enormous amount of things to discover, and they should not be shy in proposing totally new things that everyone objects to, because objections is part of the game. Basically, you need to fight them and then not be too impressed by them, I think.
Well, Dr. Frans de Waal, thank you so much for taking this time and being generous and sharing your stories with us. And to everyone in the audience, thanks for joining, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. So we'll see you next time. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Frans.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew MacIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.